There are many different types of commercially manufactured security driver pins. Each one of these pins has their own characteristic feedback and must be manipulated in a specific fashion to be successfully picked. These pins have an additional security feature. They are specifically designed to interact with and bind to the plug of the lock. This is done by a process called countermilling. Countermilling is the enlargement of a pin chamber below the shear line so that it matches the shape of the driver pin. In this case, the head of the gin spool. Let's install our gin spool driver with a key pin into a plug with matching countermilling. When tension is applied to the plug of the lock and the gin spool driver is lifted into the countermilling, the gin spool will bind and get locked into the countermilling. In order to get it out of the countermilling, it must be picked in a very specific fashion with a specialized technique known as float picking. The gin spool driver was first patented 125 years ago in 1896 by Benjamin Moser for the Russell and Irwin Manufacturing Company, which later became Russwin. In his original patent, Moser states, when an attempt is made to pick a lock, if pressure is applied to the hub, the recesses will pass upon the heads and lock the said hub and the tumblers together. In other words, when picking this lock, the heads of the gin drivers will lock into the countermilling of the plug and will prevent the lock from being picked. If we take a look at the original diagrams that accompanied this patent, we see the gin spool drivers, now highlighted in yellow, and the countermilling highlighted in red. To help us understand the complex interaction of the gin driver and its countermilling, I'll be using an innovative and novel cutaway that was manufactured in collaboration with Captain Hook No. 1. This lock is the Acetwin 6000. A portion of the Bible and plug have been removed to give us an anterior oblique cross-section of the countermilling. This will allow us to better understand and study the association and interaction of the gin driver with its complementary countermilling. So how do you pick the gin spool driver? Let's take a closer look. There are 4 phases in picking the gin spool drivers. They are, number 1, setting the gin into the countermilling. 2, unlocking the head of the gin from the countermilling by float picking. 3, clearing the shear line. And 4, differentiating the feedback of a set pin from a pin in the countermilling. Let's take a look at each of these phases in detail. The first phase of picking gin spool drivers is picking them all into the countermilling. This is the easiest step as they will pick like standard drivers with a predictable binding order. Once the last gin is lifted into the countermilling, the lock will enter into a false set. Our model only has one gin driver installed, and therefore will enter the false set once it is picked. At this point, if you tension the lock in a standard fashion and try to simply lift the driver out of the countermilling, it will not be possible, as it will not clear the lip of the countermilling. This brings us into phase 2. In order to successfully pick the gin spool driver at this point, you must unlock its head from the countermilling by manually counter-rotating the lock. Once the plug is precisely rotated, the head of the gin will be able to clear the lip of the countermilling and be set. This is accomplished using very fine tension control in one of 2 manners depending on the type of lock that you are picking. In locks which have a sidebar such as the ASA 6000, a method known as assisted float picking may be implemented. When tension is applied to a lock with a sidebar, it will compress the springs of that sidebar. This in turn will impart an equal and opposite force to the direction of the tension wrench. This allows for stabilized and precise tensioning using only one tension wrench. In locks without a sidebar element, such as the ASA 700, there will be no such opposing rotational force, and true float picking must be implemented. This is achieved with either a perfectly fitting tension wrench or with 2 tension wrenches. With 2 tension wrenches, you can apply tension in opposite directions and have complete and precise control over the position of the plug. During this phase of picking, you continuously tap the pins with your pick. With more tension applied, the gin driver will be bound to the pin chamber wall within the countermilling, and will feel as if you are hitting a solid bound pin. As more tension is released, you will feel springiness. The length of the spring travel can be indirectly measured and estimated. In the ASA 6000, it is approximately 0.64 millimeters. The plug is then slowly and precisely manually counter-rotated until the gin head clears the countermilling. In this close-up, I want you to pay special attention to how slowly the plug is being rotated as the gin head is tapped against the lip of the countermilling, and test it to see if it clears. Now look at the movement of my hand and the tension wrench as it is counter-rotating the plug. The movement is almost undetectable. This brings us to phase 3, which is clearing the shear line and setting the gin. There are two distinct types of feedback that you may feel as you clear the shear line. The first type of feedback is a sudden increase in the range of springiness. This occurs when counter rotation suddenly allows the head of the gin to clear the lip of the countermilling. In the ASA 600 or 6000, you can set the gin by lifting the key pin all the way to the top. This is because the top of the key pin is flat, and the upper range of motion will be restricted by the housing of the lock. In the ASA 700, the key pin is torpedo-shaped and has a tapered top. If you attempt to set it by lifting it and pressing it against the housing, you will risk oversetting it. The tapered section of the key pin will interact with the lip of the countermilling and push the plug open. This may cause you to drop set gins and possibly overset this key pin. Therefore, the best way to set the gin above the shear line is to estimate the height necessary to lift the gin to clear the lip by experience and muscle memory. The second type of feedback occurs when the gin head gets pinched between the lip of the countermilling and the housing of the lock. It will feel like a bound pin, and if you apply pick pressure, you will hear and feel a snap as it clears the lip and is set. Phase 4 is differentiating the feedback of a set gin from a gin in the countermilling. Once the gin is set at the shear line, it is necessary to confirm that it has indeed been set. This is done once again by bouncing the pick to feel for feedback. If you ask some of the most experienced pickers what the feedback is for a set gin, you will get two distinct responses. 50% will say that it is a hard stop, and the other 50% will report some springiness. So why the discrepancy? Let's go back to our cutaway to investigate. When the gin has been set and the key pin is bounced against the gin, there is indeed a minimal amount of springiness that can be demonstrated. However, the further the plug is rotated into a deeper false set, the less springiness there is. In this split screen view, you can see on the left panel that when the plug is in a smaller false set, the set gin is more springy, and on the right panel that when the plug is in a deeper false set, it will be less springy. I have estimated that the maximum amount of this travel for the ASA 6000 to be approximately 0.17 millimeters. With this minimal range of travel, it is not surprising that some people can feel it and some cannot. There may also be some additional factors involved. One is that the bottom of the gin has a different curvature depending on the lock. This may make some gins easier to feel. Another is that more paracentric keyways may reduce feedback. Finally, some pickers may be testing the feedback in deeper false sets, which further reduces the amount of springiness. Regardless of the feedback one feels with a set gin, either minimal springiness or a hard stop, the most important point is to differentiate it from the springiness experienced when the gin head is bounced in the countermilling. Up to now, we have discussed the theory of picking single gin drivers. Whenever you look at the interplay of a multi-element system, interactions and feedback can become much more complex. This section is intended to give some general guidelines about trends that have been observed, but may not always be accurate or effective in a given lock. When setting multiple gins above the shear line, the goal is to optimize setting the unset gins and minimize dropping the set ones. Let's take a look at two examples that may improve the chances of reaching this goal. It is important to experiment with the angle that your pick is striking the key pin to test which angle minimizes the amount of counter rotation needed to set the gin. A more vertical position of the pick typically, but not always, favors this behavior. In this example, the pick is first oriented in a more vertical position. The plug is counter-rotated and the gin head clears the shear line. Next, the pin is dropped by minimally counter-rotating the plug. This would in effect make the opening slightly larger for the gin head to clear. However, when the pick is repositioned in a more oblique trajectory, the gin is torqued and can no longer clear the shear line. Once a gin is lifted above the countermilling, the plug is rotated to capture the gin above the shear line. This is known as entering a false set. But does the amount of this rotation have an effect on dropping a set gin? Quite possibly, so you should experiment with different depths of rotation to see what works for your picking style and the lock that you are picking. One factor that may favor deeper false sets is a phenomenon I call pin drag. In this example, the gin is set and the plug is either minimally rotated or maximally rotated. On the left panel, the gin is lifted above the shear line with the plug minimally rotated to capture it. The gin then falls with a minimal amount of counter rotation. Now, on the right panel, the gin once again is lifted above the shear line, but the plug is maximally rotated. As the plug is then counter rotated, the gin is dragged along with the plug due to friction. This allows the plug to be further counter-rotated before the pin drops. In this video still, we can see that the plug that entered the deeper false set was able to be counter-rotated further before dropping the gin. As you can see, the theory of picking gins is an incredibly complex and challenging topic to cover. Over the next couple of videos, I will be implementing the techniques shown in this video to pick locks which have gin spools and associated countermilling. I hope that you enjoyed this presentation, and I would love to hear from you. Please like, comment, and subscribe.